Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. Harold never complained about life. He was born in an impoverished neighborhood, in a small town in the south, where the sun burned mercilessly and poverty covered the houses like dust. His mother died in childbirth. His father was killed in an automobile accident when Harold was only 3 years old. He grew up in an orphanage, where he learned to rely on no one but himself. But even in the midst of this chaos, Harold found reason for optimism. He had an infectious smile that made the older caretakers of the orphanage feel a little younger. He had learned to read from old books left by benefactors and loved to dream of one day becoming a man who could change the world. As an adult, Harold took a job at a night shelter for the homeless that was barely keeping afloat. He cared for the elderly, fed those who hadn't eaten in days, fixed old beds, and always found words of encouragement for those who felt forgotten. Despite his efforts, Harold's life rarely gave him gifts. He earned a pittance, barely made ends meet, but he was never discouraged. His favorite phrase was, "Even if today is bad, tomorrow we always have a chance to be better." On the streets of the city, Harold was always noticeable. Tall, thin, with a warm smile, he greeted everyone, even those who turned away or gave him scornful glances. He knew that many here only saw him for the color of his skin, but he refused to believe that it defined him as a person. Harold's only luxury was his small library. He had collected books over the years, either by finding discarded copies or receiving them as gifts from grateful visitors to the orphanage. These books were his solace when the world around him became too heavy. Harold always tried to see the best in people. Even when he was hurt, even when he was yelled at or laughed at behind his back, he responded with a smile. It was his armor. But one day fate threw him into a situation where a smile wasn't enough. The town where Harold lived was like hundreds of other towns in the southern states, hot, with dilapidated houses, abandoned stores, and asphalt cracked under the weight of time. Its residents lived their lives, rarely giving much thought to what was going on outside their own world. This town was once famous for its textile factory that fed hundreds of families, but times have changed. The factory closed, and with its demise, the hope of a stable future for most people disappeared. People out of work filled the bars and cheap eateries, complaining about life and who they thought was to blame for their troubles. The city's main street, once lively and vibrant, had become a symbol of neglect. The store signs were shabby, the windows were covered with dust, and the sidewalks were strewn with cigarette butts and scraps of garbage. The laughter of children was no longer heard here, and the music coming from the open windows of cars sounded aggressive, as if reflecting the tense atmosphere. There was a strange indifference among the locals. People did not notice other people's pain, and sometimes even enjoyed other people's misfortunes. In this city, sincere laughter was rare, but ridicule was commonplace. If someone fell or got into trouble, it was a reason to gloat. "Did you see Sammy's car get towed yesterday?" the cashier at the local supermarket giggled. "Serves him right," the man replied, putting his purchases in a plastic bag. "He's always been a loser." This kind of talk was heard everywhere. It was as if the inhabitants were competing to come up with the most sarcastic remark. Neighbors did not come to each other's aid, and strangers were viewed with suspicion or contempt. In this city, even the sunsets seemed gloomy. In the evenings, when the sky was filled with bloody light, the streets were filled with the tense hum of voices, and above it all was the noise of old air conditioners trying to squeeze out the last of their strength to save the occupants from the heat. For black people like Harold, life in this city was especially hard. Racism was not overt as it had been in the old days, but it remained in the looks, in the tone of conversations, in the way people averted their eyes or crossed the street. "Hey, look," someone said as Harold walked by. "He's smiling again. What's so funny to him?" Harold felt it every day, but he kept smiling. For him, this city was not home. It was a battlefield where kindness fought hate. Here, in this place, Harold was trying to bring something light. He saw children playing in the dirty streets, heard their laughter, and it gave him hope. But most of the residents had long since forgotten what it meant to lend a helping hand or say a kind word. This city seemed to have become an abandoned heart that could no longer love. But there lived Harold, a man who still believed that even the coldest heart could be warmed. All he had to do was keep walking forward, not even knowing that this city would soon show its true nature. The day began as usual, dragging, hot and oppressive, but by evening, the city was hit by a thunderstorm, the kind that comes on suddenly and seems to wash away the heat in an instant. The rain pounded relentlessly, pounding the roofs, washing away the dirt and debris that had accumulated on the streets. The water ran down the gutters, creating muddy streams that rushed down the road. Harold stayed late at work. The shelter had more visitors than usual. Several families had come to shelter from the rain, and one old man, shivering, asked for a drop of hot tea. Harold couldn't leave them until he was sure everyone was covered with blankets. The food was equally distributed, and the front door was firmly shut against the cold and wind. When he finally left the shelter, the rain hadn't stopped. It had only gotten heavier. His old jacket was no longer waterproof, and his boots let the water in after the first step. The street leading to his house was a muddy swamp. The sidewalks had disappeared under a layer of water, and it was impossible to know where to step without falling into a puddle. Harold, tired and drenched, walked down the street, wrapping his arms around himself for warmth. On the corner, under the canopy of an old store, some teenagers were hiding. They were laughing loudly, covering themselves with their hoods and glaring at the people passing by. One of them noticed Harold and, pushing his friend with his elbow, shouted loudly, "Hey, look, another drowning man." The boys laughed, but Harold paid no attention. He kept walking, concentrating on each step so he wouldn't slip. The rain was getting heavier and heavier, streaming down his face, mixing with drops of sweat. Ahead of him was a white puddle that had formed in the middle of the sidewalk. Harold wanted to go around it, but he didn't notice when his foot hit a slippery piece of asphalt. He slipped and fell with his whole body into the mud. The impact was painful. His knee hit a rock. His palm slammed into sharp pieces of gravel, and the muddy water soaked his clothes instantly. He groaned in pain as he tried to get up, but his legs shook and his palm slid on the wet asphalt. And then he heard laughter, a laugh that cut his soul like a knife. At first it was just a chuckle, but soon it turned into a loud, gloating laughter. Under the store's canopy, the teens pulled out their phones and started filming. "Come on, old man, fall down again," shouted one of them, pointing the camera at Harold. "We'll put you on YouTube." "Shouldn't we help him?" the other asked sarcastically. "Or can he manage on his own, as he should?" Harold closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The pain in his knee and the humiliation were burning him from the inside, but he tried not to give in to despair. Suddenly a man in an expensive coat walked past him without even stopping. The man only took a quick glance at Harold, smirked, and walked on, as if he were nothing more than dirt on the road. But Harold still wouldn't give up. He tried to get up again, leaning on whatever he could get his hands on. His pants were shredded and his hands were shaking from the cold. But he got up. The laughter behind him grew louder, the teenagers shouting insults. But he took the first step forward without turning around. Each step hurt his knee, the mud from his shoes sticking to the asphalt. But Harold kept walking. He knew he had to get home, that tomorrow would be another day, and with it a new opportunity to do something good. But the challenges ahead of him were far more difficult than mud underfoot and malicious taunts. The city was preparing to show its true colors. The rain didn't seem to be letting up. The mud beneath his feet became more and more slippery, turning the streets of the city into impassable swamps. Harold, soaked to the bone, moved forward step by step. His knee throbbed with pain from his first fall, but he tried not to think about it. He walked, not because he was confident in his abilities, but because there was no other option for him. When he reached the central square, his gaze fell on a group of people standing under the awning of the bus stop. There were about 10 of them, men and women sheltering from the rain, most of them leafing through their phones. Harold walked past, trying not to attract attention, but his wet clothes and swaying gait were already causing a lot of stares. And then fate set his foot down again. His right foot slipped on a patch of sidewalk covered with accumulated mud, and he crashed to the ground with such a sound that one of the men under the awning jumped in surprise. Harold landed on his side, then instinctively rolled over onto his back, his face contorted in pain. The puddle he'd fallen into wasn't just muddy, it was cold, icy cold, and Harold felt the water instantly soak into his clothes. He tried to get up, leaning on his elbow, but the slippery surface didn't give him a chance. He collapsed again, his palms sinking further into the mud. The silence that hung for a few moments after his fall was deafening, and then someone laughed. At first, it was a hoarse laugh, coming from the side of the bus stop, but then a few more people picked up the laughter. "Oh, look how beautifully he fell," said the woman with the umbrella, who stood closest to me. "It's comedy on the street. Somebody got it on tape," shouted a man in a cap. Harold, barely looking up, saw people start pulling out their cell phones one by one. Some were laughing, some were whispering something to a neighbor, and some were silently pointing the camera at the man lying in the mud. "Listen, let's add music to the video. It'll be great," a young guy in a sweatshirt suggested, laughing. "Hey, Mr. Smythe, you're a star now," shouted another. Harold closed his eyes, trying to pull himself together. His breathing was heavy. His knee was aching again, but it wasn't the physical sensations that hurt him the most. It was the humiliating spectacle that was playing out around him. The crowd was growing larger, people pulling in, as if this was not a rainy evening, but a show worth leaving the house for. Mark stood out from the crowd, a tall man of about 45, wearing an expensive coat that wasn't even wet from the rain. He stepped closer to Harold. There was no compassion in his eyes, only contempt. "Gee," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear him. "Well, no wonder. That's how they always end up." These words made the crowd laugh even louder. Someone shouted out, "Come help him, Mark, be a gentleman." Mark grinned, bent over Harold, and, holding the phone in his hand so as not to miss a single frame, said for all to hear, "I'd help, but why? You chose this life. You're just sitting here like a sack of dirt." Harold felt anger rising in his chest, but he knew that if he said a word now, it would be exactly what was expected of him. He made another attempt to rise, leaning on his elbows. Mark only snorted contemptuously and stepped back, and the crowd kept filming. "Look at that, a real fighter," someone shouted, and laughter filled that air again. Harold stood up, though every movement was painful. His clothes were muddy, his face wet with rain and sweat, but he was able to stand. The crowd seemed quiet for a moment, surprised by his steadfastness, but after a moment someone applauded, and again comments were made. "He should be in a circus." Harold said nothing. He staggered forward and took the first step. The laughter behind him grew quieter, but it still echoed in his ears. He walked through the puddles, feeling the cold creeping into his bones. But in that moment, something new stirred in him. It wasn't just a desire to survive or to get home. It was a strength born out of humiliation. Deep in his heart, there was a tiny spark not of anger, but of determination. The crowd that laughed at him didn't know that each thought made that spark brighter. And as people walked away, taking their phone records with them, Harold walked forward, gritting his teeth. He had no words to answer them, but he had faith that kindness would always find a way to win. Mark Wilson was one of those people who used to consider himself the master of life. He had a thriving insurance firm located in the heart of the city, a luxurious house in a wealthy neighborhood, and a collection of cars that were the envy of all the neighbors. He was always perfectly dressed, expensive suits, shirts ironed to perfection, shining shoes. His appearance spoke of success, but his eyes spoke of emptiness. Mark came from a part of society where contempt for others was inherited like a family set. His father, a prominent lawyer, had instilled in his son from childhood, people are divided into those who take and those who give. You need to be the former. This philosophy took hold in Mark. He learned to see people not as individuals, but as stepping stones to climb higher. For him, a successful person is someone who can laugh at the failures of others because he himself is never wrong. And if someone falls, this is not a reason for sympathy. It is a reason to have fun. On the evening of that rainy day, Mark walked out of his office, irritated after a long conversation with one of his clients who persistently demanded a fair payment. Mark thought of such people as parasites who tried to take what they had earned. "I tell you, Mr. Howard," he rudely interrupted the customer in mid-sentence, "your accident was your own fault. You won't get a dime." After closing the office door, Mark lit an expensive cigarette and looked around the street, as if he were not in a rundown city, but on his own personal territory. The puddles on the sidewalks disgusted him. The rain irritated him, but Mark was in no hurry. He relished his power, not even realizing how deeply this ugliness was ingrained in his soul. When he saw the crowd on the sidewalk and Harold lying in the dirt, Mark's face lit up with a smile. He sensed that a little show was playing out in front of him, one not to be missed. His eyes instantly picked up on weakness, of which he was a master. The man lying in the puddle was not suffering to him, but an object of ridicule, a convenient occasion for sarcastic comment. As he got closer, Mark heard the laughter of teenagers shouting insults. They were a kind of background to him, amplifying the effect. He pulled out his phone and pointed the camera at Harold, as if he were filming a news report. "Are you famous yet, boy?" he said with a sneer, turning up the volume so the whole crowd could hear him. "It's not every day you see a show of this caliber." His voice was cold, as if laced with venom. His voice was cold and venomous, as if he were talking to some dirty thing that had accidentally gotten in his way, rather than to a human being. "Look, why are you lying there?" he continued, bending a little lower so that the camera could get a better view of Harold's face. "Can't you get up? Or are you so used to the ground that you're comfortable here?" The crowd laughed, but Harold was silent. He raised his head, meeting Mark's gaze. There was no hatred in his eyes, only weariness and something Mark couldn't understand, patience, or perhaps contempt. "Why don't you say something?" Mark asked, but there was a note of irritation in his voice. "Or do you think silence makes you taller?" He took a step back, turning to the teens to share his triumphant performance with them. "All right, guys, who's got the coolest shot? We could have a contest, best video of the week." His words caused another wave of laughter. People in the crowd kept filming, but no one approached to offer help. Mark was enjoying the moment, feeling like a master of destiny. To him, it was a game, a little act where he was the protagonist. He thought that his actions had no consequences, that the laughter he caused was just fun. But he had no idea that in that moment he was laying the groundwork for events that would turn his own life upside down. When Harold staggered to his feet, Mark took a few steps back, not wanting to get his coat dirty. "Yeah, it was worth a look," he muttered, tucking the phone into his pocket. "Go on, keep walking. Pretend it wasn't you?" Harold said nothing. He just slowly turned around and walked forward, leaving the mud, puddles, and laughter of the crowd behind him. Mark stood in the rain, feeling superior, not even realizing that this day would be a turning point not only for Harold, but for himself as well. After all, sometimes fate, like rain, can change everything at once, washing away the masks and revealing the real faces. The cold rain poured relentlessly down the muddy streets, as if nature had decided to wash away the bitterness and cruelty of the place. The crowd around Harold was no longer just a gathering of gawkers. It was something more, a collective callousness, an embodiment of indifference that fed on weakness and suffering. But Harold, lying on the dirty sidewalk, was not ready to surrender to this force. His hands, stiff with cold and trembling with fatigue, slipped again on the wet ground. He was in pain. Every movement was a flash of searing pain in his knee and in his gravel-scarred palms, but he gritted his teeth, clenched his dirty fingers into a fist, and tried to rise. Someone in the crowd snorted, "Look, that old man is still crawling." Harold heard the taunt, but paid no attention to it. He inhaled deeply, feeling the air burn his lungs, and rose to one knee. One thought pulsed in his head: stand up, just stand up, you can. The crowd frowned. The laughter began to fade, turning to whispers. No one had expected the man, who had seemed broken a few minutes ago, to find the strength to rise. Even Mark, who was standing a little farther away with a mocking expression on his face, stopped filming. His smug grin was replaced by slight confusion. Harold leaned on his knee. Then with the last of his strength he rose to his feet. His dirty clothes clung to his body, his hair stuck to his forehead, and water dripped from his face, mixing with the mud. But he stood, not wobbling, not lowering his gaze. His eyes, dark, tired, but determined, slowly circled the crowd. No one was in a hurry to meet his gaze. Those who had been laughing the loudest a moment ago were suddenly staring at their phones or averting their eyes. Only a few people, including teenagers, continued to take pictures, but not as confidently as before. "That's it. Show's over," Harold said quietly, his voice shaking not from weakness but from cold and fatigue. "Go away." There was no anger or malice in those words, only the calm dignity of a man who had been through humiliation but had not let it break him. It was so unexpected that the crowd began to disperse. Someone threw out a phrase like, "Come on, it's getting boring." Someone snickered and hurried away into a nearby alley. Mark, still standing there, suddenly felt his superiority begin to fade. He wanted to say something again, perhaps to throw another sarcastic phrase, but Harold suddenly looked straight at him. It was the look of a man who could see right through his interlocutor. "You think you've won?" Harold said quietly, and there was no accusation in his voice, only weariness. But when a man stands on mud and thinks it's under him instead of around him, it's only a matter of time before he's in a puddle himself. The words touched something inside Mark, but he quickly dismissed the feeling with a grin. "All right, philosopher, go home before the rain washes you away completely." Harold didn't answer anything. He just turned and walked slowly forward. Each step was hard on his sore knee, and his wet boots slipped on the mud, but he kept going. He walked because he had no other choice. As he passed the teenagers, one of them, a guy with short hair and a hard apple back, muttered almost inaudibly, "Hey, excuse me." Harold stopped for a moment, turned his head and looked at him. The boy immediately averted his eyes, but Harold saw something like remorse in his face. Without saying anything, he nodded and continued on his way. It was still raining. The city was still the same cruel, filthy place, but Harold knew that even in such filth one could survive if one maintained one's dignity. He walked on, and somewhere in his soul he thought, it's not all in vain. Even if the world around you is broken, it doesn't mean that you have to be the same. Though the pain persisted, and the fatigue recalled itself with every step, Harold felt something more inside. It was a warmth that even the pouring rain could not extinguish, It warned the fortitude that he would not let the crowd or the humiliation kill him. And there was a new struggle ahead of him, because people like him don't give up. The tiny building of the night shelter for the homeless was on the outskirts of town, where bridges and ramshackle houses provided shelter for those who had lost everything. There were no brightly colored signs or landscaped sidewalks, just a modest sign above the front door that read St. Thomas Shelter. It was a place known to those who had nowhere else to go. For Harold, the shelter was more than just a job. It was his refuge, his meaning. It was here, within the warm walls, soaked with the scent of soup and freshly laundered linen, that he found the joy that the outside world could not give him. When Harold opened the door, drenched and dirty from his long journey, a girl of about 6 years of age with sly eyes and disheveled hair ran out to meet him. It was Emma, one of the orphanage's charges, whom Harold had found hiding under a bench at the train station 6 months ago. "Uncle Harold," she shouted joyfully, but her face immediately changed when she saw his condition. "What's the matter? You're covered in mud." Harold tried to smile, trying not to show fatigue. "Just rain and a little bad luck, baby," he said softly, stroking her head. "But I'm here now, and all is well." He closed the door and went into a small room that smelled of hot bread and curry. In the kitchen behind the stove stood Mrs. Hudson, a middle-aged woman who was one of Harold's most devoted helpers. She gave him a stern look, but there was a glow of concern in her eyes. "God, Harold, you're not feeling sorry for yourself again," she grumbled, handing him a clean towel. "Take these wet rags off, and I'll get you something dry." "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson, but first I need to check on the place." The shelter wasn't big, but it was comfy. A few rooms with simple bunks, a children's play area with brightly colored walls, a common room where an old fireplace was always burning, making the place a little warmer. It was all kept going by donations, which were always in short supply, and by the endless work of Harold and his few helpers. Harold took off his wet jacket and walked to the common room. There were a few people sitting there, a homeless woman in an old coat whom he had recently helped find temporary work in the kitchen, 2 teenagers playing board games, and an elderly man strumming an old guitar. "Harold, are you all right?" the old man asked, setting aside his tool. "Rough day." "It's been worse, Henry," Harold replied, sinking into the chair next to the fireplace. "But it's all right now. How's your guitar?" Henry smiled, running his fingers over the strings. "She's alive, and so am I. Thanks for fixing it." That was the essence of Harold's work. Every day he gave a piece of himself so that others could feel a little warmth and care. It was important to him not just to give people food and a roof over their heads, but to give them back their dignity, to let them know that they mattered, despite everything that had happened in their lives. When it was time for dinner, Harold joined the communal table. At its Saturday, everyone who had taken refuge in the shelter that night, children, old people, young people, he knew each one by name, knew their stories and pains. They laughed, told of their small successes, and although their lives were full of hardship, in that moment they all felt part of one big family. After supper, Harold went up to help Emma brush her teeth and put her to bed. In her little bed under the pink blanket Mrs. Hudson had given her, the little girl asked quietly, "Uncle Harold, why are you so kind?" The question caught him off guard, but he smiled quickly and stroked her head. "Because someone was once kind to me," he answered. Emma nodded as if she understood completely, and was asleep in a few minutes. Harold quietly left the room and closed the door behind him. The night was dark, and the rain outside the window was still falling. Harold stood at the window, looking at the shadows cast by the street lamps. He knew that tomorrow would be another hard day, but that didn't scare him. The shelter was his mission, his response to the cruelty of the world. Here he saw that despite all the suffering, goodness could still exist, and that gave him the strength to go on. There was no wealth, fame or recognition in his life, but every thank you, every warm look, Every smile of a child was worth more than any material wealth. Harold was no hero, but for those who came to the orphanage, he was salvation. And without even realizing it, Harold was becoming that ray of light that might one day change the world. As usual, Harold arrived at the shelter early the next day, when the town was just beginning to wake up. He was preparing breakfast for his charges, arranging porridge on plates, unaware that at that very moment his face was spreading across the internet, becoming a symbol of mockery and cruelty. Mark's video from the day before suddenly went viral. It shows Harold, covered in mud and wet to the skin, trying to get up on the sidewalk amid the jeers of the crowd. Mark's camera catches his every movement, every painful attempt to get up, every look of indifferent gawkers, but instead of sympathy, the video was accompanied by a sarcastic comment. Here's a lesson in what it means to be a loser. Fall down. Stay in the mud. The recording quickly went viral on social media. People forwarded it to each other, accompanied by sarcastic comments. Classic, it's your own fault. This is definitely someone's life is pain meme. Did you see the way he looks at the camera? Definitely a second-rate actor. Some added sound effects to the video, turning Harold's fall into a comic clip. It appeared on popular platforms, reaching thousands of views and then millions. Hundreds of people shared it, adding new mocking tags and memes to the discussion. Mark woke up the next day to find his social media posts filled with likes and comments. He was proud of himself, thinking that he had created a masterpiece. His friends wrote to him, "Hey, did you shoot this? Handsome. The guy's a hoot. Best video of the month. You're a celebrity now." Meanwhile, Harold, completely unaware of what was happening, was minding his own business. At lunchtime, Mrs. Hudson drove up to the shelter, holding an old smartphone. She looked worried. "Harold," she began, looking at him anxiously. "Did you see that?" He looked puzzled at her phone, where a video was playing on the screen. For several seconds, Harold stared silently at his own image falling into the dirt, at the jeers of the crowd, and especially at Mark's face, a close-up of his moment of humiliation. Mrs. Hudson added quietly, "This video has already been seen by millions of people. It's everywhere. People are laughing at you." Harold looked away, feeling a heaviness rise in his chest. He thought about how the video distorted his reality. No one knew why he was there, what he felt, what he had experienced. To them, he was just a meme hero, a new object of ridicule. In the evening, as news of the viral video spread, people started coming to the shelter. Some of them were just looking through the windows. Others were taking pictures of the building, hoping to see the man in the video. Children from the shelter started asking, "Uncle Harold, is it true that people on the internet are laughing at you?" He didn't know what to say. He was hurt, but he knew that anger and despair would not change anything. Instead, he said to the children, "Sometimes people laugh because they don't understand, but that doesn't make them stronger, and it doesn't make us weaker." Meanwhile, more comments started appearing on the internet. Some people began to wonder, who was this man? Why was he in such a state? But the wave of hatred and ridicule overshadowed everything. Harold didn't know that this video would be the beginning of a chain of events that would change his life forever. The viral humiliation turned into a new challenge he had to overcome. But he already knew that his strength lies in his ability to withstand any blow, even if it comes from the whole world at once. It's been a few days since the video of Harold went viral on the internet. The wave of ridicule and vicious comments continued to gather strength, but in this sea of cynicism and indifference there was one spark of truth. It came from an anonymous letter that suddenly appeared in Mark's mailbox. He didn't open it right away. Lately, his life had been filled with messages and comments that made his phone ring off the hook. On his account, more and more people started discussing the video he had posted. and Mark began to feel like a real internet celebrity. But among all these messages, he noticed something unusual: a letter signed simply "Famous." As he read it, Mark felt a strange mixture of doubt and confusion. Someone who knew Harold had decided to tell the truth about him. Someone who apparently couldn't stay silent any longer, having seen how the world had distorted reality. Letter: Mark, I don't want you to think I'm trying to judge you, but I can't stay silent when someone you know absolutely nothing about is being mocked on the internet. Harold is not who you made him out to be. The man you showed in the video is not who he is. He is worthy of respect, not ridicule. He's a man who will always be there for you when you are in need, who gives his last to help others. I know him not by hearsay, but personally. He works at a night shelter for the homeless, helps children, cooks meals for them, and gives care to those on the streets. And it's not just his job, it's his life. He will never leave anyone without help, even if he himself is in trouble. He was also my friend when I had no one. I was homeless and he reached out to me, without asking for anything, without judging. He just helped me. If you knew his real story, you would never laugh at him. He lost everything, but he found the strength to live, to help and to be kind, despite how cruel the world is. I know you're a person who is always looking for excuses for your actions, but look at this video again. Imagine that you are him. You may not be able to understand how a person who is humiliated by everyone feels, but at least think about what you've done. Harold is the kind of person you can say, he doesn't just live, he makes the world a little brighter. And if you don't have the courage to admit that what you did was wrong, know this: many people, those who really know Harold, will support him, and this world won't laugh at him. It won't. When Mark finished reading the letter, his jaw dropped involuntarily. He put the phone away and leaned back against the desk, feeling his chest tighten with anxiety. The scene from the video was still in his mind's eye: the laughter, the mocking, the moment when he himself had felt he gained popularity by making fun of someone else. But now, after those words, everything was different. He began to doubt himself. The person who wrote this letter knew Harold for real. He spoke of him as if he had witnessed how this man lived every day, how he fought to be the best in a world that didn't always recognize such qualities. Mark didn't know what to do with that knowledge. He opened the video again and looked at it as if trying to justify his behavior. But now the look wasn't so confident anymore. The letter touched him like a blow. He could not simply dismiss the words. His laughter, his desire to be popular at someone else's expense, suddenly seemed insignificant, even pathetic. What did he really know about Harold? He had been one of those who had watched him fall mockingly, but he had not seen the man behind the trouble. The man who carried with him wounds that no amount of laughter could heal. Mark sat in complete silence, internally torn. He realized that he couldn't just take it all back. How many people had already seen the video? How many cruel comments had been left online? All of this wasn't just about Harold. It was about a society that laughs without realizing how broken it is. It was about people who might be different if they weren't taught to despise, but instead to help those in need. But now, perhaps this was his chance to make things right. There was a new impulse inside Mark, something that told him that he could and should do more than just continue to sit in his comfort, ignoring those who couldn't afford it. Mark didn't know what to do with the letter, but something inside told him he shouldn't leave it as it was. For several days, Mark could not forget about the letter. He did not know what to do with this knowledge, which now lived restlessly in his mind. Each time the prick of conscience felt stronger and stronger, like a small needle that pierced his thoughts. He tried to go on with his life as if nothing had happened, but the inner conflict kept growing. Something important had changed in him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. One fall morning, as he sat in his apartment browsing through his news feed, his gaze happened to fall on one photograph. It was a snapshot taken at an orphanage, the very children the letter writer had mentioned. They were sitting at a table, smiling, doing something simple and sincere. In the background was Harold with a large dish of soup in his hands. His face was calm, but his eyes expressed some extraordinary kindness and care. It was a photograph, taken without any thought of hiding anything or showing anyone, just a moment in the life of the orphanage captured in a single frame. Mark felt his chest tighten. Something about these faces, these children, sincere and defenseless, shook him to the core. He couldn't forget how he himself had laughed at Harold, calling him a loser and a stupid fool without knowing who he really was. He'd never thought about what was behind the men at all until he read the letter, but it was as if that picture made it all obvious. What if he had been in those children's shoes, in Harold's shoes? What if he himself had found himself without help and support, like those living in the orphanage? He was so absorbed in his own world that he didn't notice the suffering of those around him, didn't realize how much pain his actions could cause without even noticing it. With his smartphone in hand, Mark reopened the video he had once proudly posted. It was the very scene of Harold falling into the mud while trying to get up. He watched as his laughter and taunts could be heard in the background of every step, every fall he took. But it didn't seem so funny now. He saw it not as an object for laughter, but as a living person who had been humiliated and insulted simply for being vulnerable. This wasn't his success. It was someone else's pain. Mark closed his eyes, trying to figure out what he should do next. He was looking for excuses for himself, as he always did after all. He had just made a video. He was just on trend. But something told him that there could be no excuses when it came to human life. Something inside of him began to change, as if his mind had been closed to the simplest of truths: we are all vulnerable. We can all be in need. Mark picked up his phone and began scrolling through its feed. He came across the photo from the orphanage again, the children with happy faces, Harold standing among them with a smile. Involuntarily, his hand frowned, and he realized that this photo was not just an image, but a kind of revelation to him. These children, so alive, so real, they were not mere objects for pity, as he had previously thought. They were ones he had to respect and appreciate. And Harold, too, was part of that kindness. He logged into his account and began to look at the comments under the video. All the same sarcastic remarks, the same insults, and yet, among them, one single word that stuck out to him: shame. It was said by a man who condemned everyone who made fun of Harold, who was part of that terrible chain of ridicule and cruelty. For a moment, Mark realized that the word could very well apply to him now. He looked at the pictures again. Their eyes were looking at him, and he felt something dark inside him begin to clear. He couldn't keep playing a role where he was indifferent and cruel. He began to think that maybe it was time to change things. Mark found the address of the shelter and thought, maybe there was something I could do. A plan was born in his head, not just to apologize, but to change his attitude about what he had done. He began to type, and though his fingers trembled, he knew it was the only way to make amends. He wrote a post in the group he was associated with the video. He couldn't erase it from the internet, but he could show that not everything in this world is so unambiguous. Hi everyone, I want to apologize to everyone who was offended by my video. I didn't think I could hurt, but I was wrong. There was a person in the video who deserves respect, and I shouldn't have made fun of him. I will try to do better, and if you can support me, I will do whatever I can to help those in need. It was his first real confession, and Mark knew it was only the beginning of a journey, but he was ready to go down that path, no matter how difficult it was. He had to change something about himself, and it had to start with finally realizing what it meant to be human. Harold didn't know about Mark's remorse. He didn't even know that he was trying to justify his actions, to apologize and change his attitude. Harold's world was quite different, filled with care and pain, but at the same time an imperceptible inner strength. He did not seek forgiveness from those who humiliated him, nor did he expect anyone to apologize to him. The most important thing for him was that he stayed true to his principles, and that was far more important than anyone's remorse. Harold started each day by walking around the orphanage in the early hours, checking to see if everything was in order, if food for the children and adults was missing, if there were any small problems. He knew how hard it was to wake up when the whole world seems to be against you, but he believed that in small acts of kindness there was a great strength hidden. This was his world, a world in which, despite all his troubles, he felt needed and important. It was in these morning hours, when everyone was just waking up, that he could find silence and his inner harmony. When he met the children sitting at the table again, their smiles filled his soul with light again. He Saturday down next to them and began to tell them stories about how they could change the world by being kind and honest. He said that it didn't matter what others thought of you, it mattered what you thought of yourself, and that everyone can be strong, even if they are having a hard time. For Harold, everything remained the same. He continued to give his time and energy to those who needed help, to those who might not have found it anywhere else. Every morning and every evening, he met people who were looking for shelter, looking for friendship and support. He knew that these people did not come here by chance, that for many of them, this was the only place where they were understood and not judged. Mark's letter, and then his apology, did not change anything in Harold's life. He was content to live his life, and the confessions and remorse of others didn't matter to him. What had happened to him on the street, that fall in the mud, was not the main thing in his life. It was part of the path he had traveled, as painful as it was. But he knew that life wouldn't stop at what other people might or might not understand. What mattered was that he kept moving forward. In turn, continued to work, help and support people who also had to face the injustice and cruelty of the world. Every day Harold realized that it was important to stay true to his principles, despite the pain and humiliation, and although he knew that many people were simply not ready to understand what true kindness and compassion were, he did not let them change his inner vision of the world. There were days when it was hard for him. There were times when fatigue took its toll, when inner voice screamed at him to back off, to just stop fighting for others. But Harold always knew it was worth living through those moments. He believed that every good deed, even if it went unnoticed, mattered. It was far more important to him than public recognition or someone's remorse. As he strolled down the street again in the evening, he noticed how other people passed him glances, the way they sometimes saw him but didn't see him. They were stares like the ones he had received the day he fell in the mud. But now Harold was not angry. He had already learned to take this world as it was, and not to demand more from it than it had to offer. People, they had always been like that. Some saw it, others didn't. But that didn't stop him from continuing on his way. And so, even with all he had been through, Harold continued to work at the orphanage. His days were filled with caring for others, and his heart, despite everything, remained open and pure. It didn't matter to him who thought what anyone thought of him. What mattered was that he stayed true to himself. Mark's remorse, like any other form of regret, did not change Harold's life. He didn't wait for an apology, didn't seek revenge. His life was enough. It was full of meaning, even if others couldn't understand it. Harold knew that his path had been chosen by himself, and that despite the pain, he would always follow those principles. It had been months since the day Harold had fallen in the mud, becoming an object of ridicule and hatred for the crowd. But for him, it was all in the past. He continued on his journey, each day starting with caring for others, with a quiet confidence that even the smallest acts of kindness could create a huge change in the world. He was sure that the world could be a better place, and that it was people like him who had the power to change the world. Recently, it has become more and more common to see new faces at the shelter, people who in the past did not know where to go, did not know who could help them. Some came in with big eyes full of questions, others with pain that was deeper than their external wounds. But each of them faced the same thing, heralded the fact that kindness is usually rarely seen, but it always stays in its place, quietly and persistently. Harold became more and more convinced that there was room for good in the world. He knew that people around him were not always ready to understand this, that society was often more judgmental than supportive, but he also knew that one sincere smile, one word of encouragement could bring hope where there was none. One evening, as he was again sitting at table with the children, he noticed among them one new boy who seemed to be in utter despair. He was silent and secretive, hardly looking at the others. Harold went over to him, sat down beside him, and said quietly, "You are not alone. We're all one family here, and if you need to talk or just sit, you can always do so." The boy, not expecting such words, looked up at him. His eyes were full of doubt, but something flashed in them that Harold immediately realized was hope. This moment was a confirmation to him that he was right. Every word, every action, no matter how small, can change someone's life. He was a living example that the kindness of one person can affect those who don't even believe in goodness. He knew that such acts could not be forgotten, even if the crowd would laugh or look past it. After all, the most important thing is that there is still room in the world for people who are willing to love and help. And while the rain continued to fall outside the window, Harold, despite all his difficulties, remained a man who believed in the power of goodness. He never asked if he would get something in return. He gave because he knew that even if his efforts went unnoticed, they would remain important. He continued on his path, helping those who were looking for light in the world. He was convinced that such light would not be lost. Mark, meanwhile, has never been able to forget the day he read the letter and thought about his behavior for the first time. His life, like many others, changed after he realized how much his actions could hurt others. He continued to redeem himself by volunteering in various social projects, and more often thought about the fact that everyone has a right to a chance, and the world would be a better place if we were kind to each other instead of cruel to each other. There was one important point in this process of rebirth that he could not ignore. Harold, this man with a huge heart, continued on his path, not hoping for gratitude, not expecting recognition. He believed that the world was not a place for hatred and ridicule, but a place for caring and support. He was living proof that one kind soul can make a difference, even if everyone around him is silent and laughing. Harold's story became a symbol of change. His example inspired people not only in the orphanage, but also outside of it. He wasn't trying to change the world. He was just living what he thought was right. But there was much more power in that than changing someone's life with one decision. Harold was someone who showed others that kindness was not a weakness, but a true strength, and that even if the whole world laughs, you can still be human. Hope, like, is not always visible, but it is always there, wherever you are, and it will find those who are able to see it. It was a story about a man who fell but didn't give up. A story about how kindness can change the world, even if it doesn't happen right away. And about this world that may one day be a better place, because those who believe in kindness never stop looking for the light. Thank you for your attention, and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.